The trees are, trees are very, they're iconic. They're fundamental. I mean, my introduction to plants was growing up out here and falling in love with the redwoods and, kind of the big conifer forests of the Sierra. But then realizing, it's how do you, there are 150 plus species taxa in California across a myriad habitats. How do we cram this all in? So this was a challenging talk to put together, and I hope organize it in a way that is, fluid, or at least maybe gets your interest if nothing else. I'll be going over kind of taking a broad approach, looking at, kind of the patterns where trees occur, what type of associations there are in those. And then thinking about, we'll talk about specific groups with a focus on conifers, big focus on conifers, because I think that they ecologically tell, a really distinct story about how a lot of plants and trees have evolved, with the unique kind of climate and habitats of California, but also talk about oaks and several other kind of interesting and relevant species around here. As Mila mentioned, there will be kind of a question and answer section at the end of this, but if there's anything that's unclear throughout, feel free to, kind of enter it in the question box and try to make sure and kind of head that off as it comes along. Okay. Oops. So starting off with the basics, what exactly is a tree? Seems like a simple enough question, but be surprised at how convoluted it can get. Textbook definition, a tree is traditionally thought of as a generally tall, perennial, woody plant that has a single stem, the trunk, arising from ground level. And that's kind of in juxtaposition against shrubs. And shrubs are thought of as perennially woody plants of relatively low stature, typically with several stems arising from or near ground level. In the photos I have, we have a very tall sugar pine, single stem, right from the ground, and on the right is the local Kings Mountain manzanita, where you can see right at ground level, there are multiple stems coming up from the base there. So, okay, clear enough, but what's this that our friend Jesse is standing in front of, this manzanita? Is that a tree or a shrub? Some definitions consider any woody plant above 10 feet to technically be a tree. Some people consider all manzanitas to diagnostically be shrubs. Is this one stem, or what's that to the bottom left? That's the second stem coming out here. Is it a tree or a shrub? An arborescent shrub? What about this? This is in the Klamath region, and from the photo, what we see is what looks like a prostrate, creeping, kind of mounding plant. I would be hard pressed to imagine this as having a single woody stem, and it's definitely not above 10 feet. But the actual species is Juniperus communis, the common juniper, a tree that occurs globally. And it's kind of the mountain variety Saxatilis that has a very prostrate, it would be hard pressed to even call this a shrub, really. And what about this one? Iconic plant. Is it a tree, a shrub, or what? The common name, everyone knows it by Joshua tree. I also see several stems coming up there from the base, and it's definitely above 10 feet. But what exactly is it? This is Joshua tree is Yucca filamentosa. The genus Yucca is, it's a monocot. By definition, monocots do not produce true wood. So any of the stems that you're seeing here, they're definitely very hard. They're definitely wood-like, but they don't contain lignin. By definition, Joshua trees are not trees. They're erect, stalked succulents in a lot of ways. Anyway, I bring these up not to kind of parse semantics or get into details, but just to emphasize the point that we come up with with these modes of classification to help us organize and make sense of, the organisms that we're observing and thinking of. It's not always cut and dry. What one person calls a tree, others could see as a shrub, and so on. But it's just thinking about the language and the way you see things and are interacting with them, and just putting that out there is sort of foundational as we start getting into this. But okay, trees of California. We have around 150 species that are native to California, and that's not including subspecies and varieties. And put that in context, in all of North America, there are around 1,000 species. And so we actually have a pretty substantial concentration of trees within the California floristic province. What's interesting about that is California is, thinking about, it's very different from much of the bulk of North America. Most of the Midwest and Eastern North America are, the natural areas are predominantly broadleaf, deciduous, temperate woodland. These are areas that are 90 plus percent, or around 80 to 90% forested ecosystems. California, our forests encompass around 20 to 30%. The dominant ecosystem in California is chaparral, which is a fire-prone shrub-dominant habitat. We have quite a bit of land encompassed by desert. We have old dunes. We have historic wetlands in the Central Valley, historic grasslands. So despite, a high percentage of the land not being systems that are dominated by trees, we actually contribute some of the highest species richness and diversity of trees to North America. And why is that? A lot of it has to do with the fact that California, the California floristic province, we are one of the 5 Mediterranean climate regions in the world, where, the climate is defined by our growing season is in the winter and early spring. That's when we get our water. Come summertime, when temperatures go up, things that would be typically ideal for plant growth, well, sure, temperatures are there, but what happened to the water? They have to deal with six, maybe more months of almost no rain, no precipitation at all. So evolutionarily, over long periods of time, that's given rise to a very unique assemblage of plants, many of which are endemic, only found within California, or, lots of plants that are very locally adapted to this. Whereas again, Midwest North America, wintertime, it's cold, many plants go dormant. Deciduous plants lose their leaves. The growing season is in the summer. Things start warming up in the spring. Warmer temperatures coupled with copious amounts of rain. It flips the script out here. So we have a very different system, but also our topography is a big reason for this. From the coast, we have beaches, we have sand dunes, coastal mountains, local, various patches of degrees of native bunchgrass, grasslands, wetlands, brackish tidal marsh, freshwater marsh, the large Sierra, Cascades, Klamath Mountains, 3 different desert biome regions, the Sonoran, Mojave, and Great Basin deserts, and even the San Joaquin. So we have quite an impressive array of habitats and landscapes, and each of those support their own sort of unique assemblage of plants, and that's reflected in the diversity. And of course, soils too. People, you may have heard of serpentine soils, which are basically toxic for most generalist plants, and so they give rise to plants that have evolved specifically to cope with the conditions of that soil, which otherwise are too stressful or nutrient deficient for other plants to grow. So you have serpentine, volcanic soils. We have certain areas where there's very acidic marine sandstones, tropical oxasols in the Ione Formation in the Sierra foothills, granites, and so on. So again, the soils are going to drive what what type of vegetation is there. And when you have that type of diversity of soils, it gives rise to diversity of plants. California hosts many champion trees. And what I mean by that is sort of globally record-breaking trees. We have the tallest tree in the world, the coast redwood in Humboldt County, the oldest single organism of a tree, which is the ancient bristlecone pine in the White Mountains. We have the world's heaviest pine cone, encompassed by the coulter pine, which you could see nearby in Mount Diablo. And we also have the world's longest pine cone, the sugar pine. A sip of water. And so when we refer to trees, there's some kind of broad categorizations. People refer to them as broadleaf trees versus conifers as two major groups. Broadleaf trees, put simply, they're plants that have relatively wide, flat leaves rather than needle-like leaves. And conifers are trees that bear cones and are typically evergreen with needle-like or scale-like leaves. Some examples I put are the top two photos. On the left, we have our local big leaf maple with very flattened, sort of plainer leaves, very broad-leaved, and the coulter pine again on the right with the classic needle-like leaves that pines are known for, enclosed within fascicles. That are basically the term for what hold the clusters of needles. Deciduous versus evergreen just refers to, deciduous means that plant parts, in this case leaves, are persistent for one growing season and then they fall off or senesce. Versus evergreen, which is where plant parts, leaves, are persistent for 2 or more growing seasons. So here on the left, we have the Shreve oak, where we have very thick, leathery evergreen leaves that will retain. They'll stay on for several growing seasons, eventually discard and produce new ones. But over the life cycle of that plant, there are always leaves that are actively photosynthesizing. On the right here, we have quaking aspen, which you can see this was in this past October. You can still see some green leaves in the background, but as temperatures start to cool down, these occur in higher mountain regions where you're dealing with a very cold, kind of long, very cold temperatures. So it makes sense. It's selected to discard, selectively favorable to lose your leaves during the winter. And so as that goes on, you see the leaves kind of fading towards the yellow and red, kind of the fall color foliage, and that would be deciduous. So forests, these forests bring it up in a broad sense because these are where these are our tree dominated habitats. In California, they encompass about 27% of the land area. And these are broken into kind of broad categories that have, I won't say alliances, but kind of dominant trees that define these regions. So some examples here are the coastal closed cone coniferous forests. And these are where you'll find stuff like Monterey pine, Bishop pine, Monterey cypress, or Santa Cruz cypress. So it's, stuff that's right along the coast, sometimes right on the headlands, such as the case of Monterey cypress. And then we also have, conversely, interior closed cone coniferous. These are, as the crow flies, these are not that far from the coast, but a very different temperature gradient, different stresses, probably different soils, and generally warmer environments where you'll find stuff like knobcone pine, Sargent cypress, McNabb cypress. Our coastal conifer forests are kind of classically defined by the coast redwood, and those tend to dominate and really occupy sort of the bottom sort of valleys or the bottomlands of those forests, where on the slopes around them, where there's a break in the canopy, you'll find stuff like tan oak, madrone, Douglas fir, California bay. And within our kind of in the coast range forests, but also in some of the lower elevation foothill forests of the Sierras, Klamath, get taxa like California nutmeg, coast live oak, coast chinkapin. amongst others. And montane coniferous refers to sort of the mid to high elevation mountain forests of the Sierra, Cascades, Klamath. Dominant trees you'll find are ponderosa pine, sugar pine, incense cedar, and you'll still get Douglas fir getting fairly high up. And the other types are woodlands, which categorically encompass about 15% of the land area in California. And how these differ from forests is that they're typically composed of smaller trees, and there's not as much of a continuous tree cover. So you'll more of kind of a patchy distribution. So you have trees interspersed by grassland or shrubs, maybe chaparral, depending on where you're at in the state. So one example of this is desert woodland, which you'll get kind of in the mid to higher elevations in kind of the Great Basin portions of the state in particular. These are dominated by pinyon pine and juniper. There's California juniper, but also the Utah juniper. So these are often referred to as pinyon juniper woodland. And the other big one is oak woodland. And this is a really important habitat type within California, but it's also one of our most threatened plant communities. This is due to development, urban sprawl, vineyard expansion, livestock grazing, fire suppression, and invasion by non-native plants. And these are broken up into in several different subcategories, but in a general sense, you can think of kind of the really hot and dry interior oak woodlands, sometimes referred to as oak savanna. Like the photo in the bottom here, these are often also thought of as blue oak woodlands, and the dominant oaks that you'll find are blue oak and interior live oak. Sometimes you'll get pine like gray pine, Pinus sabiniana. And these are ones that really just can handle the really just kind of punishing dry summer heat. And in valley bottoms, you tend to get valley oak and coast live oak dominating, really kind of forming often these wide canopies, broad branching, very large trees. And in areas that are kind of more mesic or experience higher precipitation, cooler, more wet environments, you get woodlands dominated by Gary oak and California black oak. One other woodland type that we have all throughout the state is riparian woodlands, which is very dynamic according to where you're at as far as what species you'll find. But in general, they're dominated by broad-leaved deciduous trees. And these are all different species that relying upon having accessible water year-round. So this will be along rivers, freshwater wetlands, creeks, perennial seeps, anything where water is at least accessible to the roots later on in the summer. Common groups that you get are willows, alders, cottonwoods and aspens, western sycamore, big leaf maple, Oregon ash, as well as California ash, and box elder maple. So moving forward, the first group that I want to cover, and as I mentioned, we'll really be kind of focusing in on these, are conifers. And so conifer is derived from the term conifer is derived from Latin. Conos just means a cone, and ferum to bear. These are plants that, they're not producing flowers. They're gymnosperms, so they're naked seeds. These are the cones of their reproductive structures. This is a very old, I should say, early evolving group of plants. They're thought to have arisen around 300 million years ago. And just a note for reference, angiosperms, flowering plants, they arose and very rapidly diversified about 140 million years ago. These are large timescales, but just to give you an idea of how long conifers have been around in general, and a testament to their success evolutionarily, that they are still very much predominant around the globe and very successful life strategy despite so many different major climatic shifts, ice ages and so on over time. And so globally, there are 7 to 8 families of conifers, 70 genera, and around 627 species. And so compared to flowering plants, it's a pretty small number. However, it should note that despite the low species numbers, no matter, they do occur globally, and where they occur, they tend to be very, very predominant, and often they're a very prominent feature of the ecosystems in which they're in, and very defining characters. So they're still have very kind of important ecological roles where they do occur. In California, we have around 48 species, and it's worth noting this area that is called the Miracle Mile. It's in the Klamath Mountains, and it's a stretch where it's the only place in the world where you can, within a single square mile, you can be surrounded by 18 species of conifers. And thus it's considered the richest conifer habitat on Earth. It's an amazing area, definitely worth checking out in the summer. And so as far as the kind of taxonomic groups go, we have 3 representative families of conifers in California. Cupressaceae, which is the cypress family. This has Hesperocyprus, which are the cypresses, several genera of cedars, junipers, and also our redwood and sequoias and sequoiadendron. The pine family, which beyond pines, pinus, we have firs, spruce, Douglas fir, and hemlocks. And then less representative, but we do have 2 members of the Taxaceae, which are the California nutmeg and yew. And right here on the right in the photo is the Port Orford cedar, a Klamath Mountains endemic that it's unfortunately a rare and threatened plant, but it occurs in these really kind of amazing, very often very mesic and wet environments, but often on serpentine soils. It's a really interesting plant communities that is worth checking out. So some ecological trends of conifers. As far as their current distribution, many occupy relictual ranges. And what I mean by that is that, again, think about how long they've been around and how much time they've had to evolve. Many of the species, such as redwood, for instance, formerly occupied, currently they only occur in California. They formerly occurred all over the globe, had a much larger distribution. As climates have shifted, things have changed. There's kind of a retreats and expansions repeatedly, and then within this latest kind of trend of drying and warming, they've retreated to, in the case of redwoods, a narrow belt along the coast, basically relying on summer fog as sort of this one niche where they're able to hold on. And so we say that the redwood is endemic to California, a California endemic, but it's not unlike neo-endemics like many of our annuals, flowering plants, and our bulbs and geophytes. We consider this a paleo-endemic because it formerly was much more widespread, but now only occurs within California. And so a strategy that a lot of conifers have, one reason they're still very successful is they employ this sort of evasive survival strategy, where they're able to thrive in very suboptimal, often nutrient poor sites and stressful climates. So right here in the top photo, we have Sierra juniper. It's a kind of an amazing plant. Love seeing it. Grows at very high elevations in the Sierra Nevada. It's basically growing straight out of granite at, let's say 8,000, 9,000 feet, getting battered by high winds, buried by snow and freezing temperatures most of the year, with very few nutrients to kind of take up. And there's not much else growing there, but they're able to thrive. That's their niche they've kind of evolved towards, and sort of how they've been able to persist. And Um, Here on the bottom right, we have Monterey cypress. It's a plant that's ornamentally planted all over the place, so people may not think of it as kind of this extremophile in a lot of ways, but it's in its native habitat. It grows right on sea bluffs, high wind environments, salt spray, often growing straight out of rock. If there's much soil, it's extremely nutrient poor. It's an extremely challenging environment, especially for a tall woody plant. So the fact that they've been able to kind of capitalize on this niche is pretty phenomenal. But something to note about that, just because they sort of have evolved to be selectively favored for these stressful environments, it's not always preferred. And that can be seen by Monterey cypress that are planted all, ornamentally throughout the state. If you go to Monterey County, say, around Pacific Grove, that area, and you see the native stands of Monterey cypress, you'll see kind of this, it's called kind of a Krumholtz, very windblown kind of form, where they're basically sculpted by predominant winds, salt spray, and otherwise. Like this, you go to Golden Gate Park and they're just growing, vertically straight with a kind of uniform canopy, 100 some odd feet tall, and not looking anything like this. So it's not preferred, but they have a tolerance for it. They're not always reliant upon these kind of stressful conditions, but they've selectively kind of traded off to be able to tolerate it. And it's a way that they sort of have evolutionary escaped from competition with angiosperms, flowering plants, which traditionally are fast growing, they're broad-leaved. Conifers are relatively slow growing, and the needles, they're small leaved. They're not as photosynthetically efficient for the most part. And as mentioned, globally, they have relatively low diversity, but a very extensive distribution, and often monotypic dominant stands, meaning you'll find stands of a single species kind of extending pretty extensively. And they're also edaphic specialists, meaning soil specialists. So they've evolved to be able to tolerate very challenging and nutrient-poor soils, like serpentine. This photo on the right, we have a Sargent cypress growing basically directly out of these serpentine outcrops in Mendocino County. Serpentine in general, most generalist plants cannot tolerate how the soils are toxic to them. So most plants that can tolerate it are specialists or endemics. And a lot of those are very short in stature. Not many woody plants can tolerate it, let alone trees. Sargent cypress are one of the few trees that actually can dominate in serpentine habitat. There are others that grow on, like this gray pine, growing in iron-rich tropical oxasols on the Sierra Nevada foothills. Some grow in volcanics and sandstone. So interestingly, and thinking about California, and maybe why conifers are very successful here too, is many of them have a really tight, interlinked evolutionary relationship with fire. The term serotiny is used, which refers to seeds that are released in response to certain environmental cues. In the case of fire, this is termed pyrescence. So basically, if you look at, for instance, the knobcone pine in the top left here, those cones are mature and they will stay on the tree enclosed, kind of sealed with this thick resin until fire or some very high heat episode comes through. Once it does, that's an environmental cue. The resin breaks and all of the seeds are dispersed right then. It's selected for environments that deal with regular periods of fire intervals. When you have a fire regime, let's say coming through once every 30 to 50 years, these are slow growing plants. In time, they'll be outcompeted, maybe shaded out by other broadleaf plants that can grow fast. But if they're selected for fire, those other plants that don't have mechanisms that can tolerate it, those will be cleared out by the fire. These, sure, they might die in the fire, but that's a standing seed bank. and the whole new generation basically has a clean slate to get established. It's been very successful for that group of closed cone pines. And this evidence of serotiny in plants dates back to around 350 million years ago. So it's not necessarily even recent. But just a note, beyond California, serotiny is exhibited in Mediterranean climate regions around the globe at high levels. And in pines, it likely evolved in the Cretaceous, 145 to 66 million years ago. In California, about 5 million years ago in the late Miocene. And that's when we really started getting a lot of these more, to our knowledge, increased fires. So functionally, kind of mentioned this, but it's an interesting juxtaposition. So for conifers, it means that seed storage and protection is in a canopy seed bank. Those familiar with the ideas of a soil seed bank, so manzanitas, some ceanothus, chamise, they produce dormant seed that have evolved with fire. They will sit dormant, in the soil in rodent caches, often for decades, and they won't germinate until a fire comes through and gives chemical cues to germinate. Conifers, the seed bank is above ground, being held in these closed cones. And so, yeah, it's kind of a flip of the script in that way. Again, they just sort of await the high heat to melt the resins, and then following that, they have ample dispersal right away. They're put right on the soil, and likely followed by the rainy season once fire season ends, and so they can germinate. And these seeds disperse in a nutrient-enriched environment that are then free of competition, and they have a full open canopy, full sun. Some of our fire pines, as they're called, are knobcone pine, Monterey pine, and bishop pine. And these all have, the pines stay on they basically stay on the stem of the plant, like I said. And again, you'll see on the right here, that's what happens once a fire goes through and the seeds are released. And this is also well represented in many of our cypress. So there's Baker cypress, or Modoc cypress, Tecate cypress, McNabbs, Paiute cypress, and Sargent cypress. As you can see in the photo on this bottom left, same thing. It's a different group of plants, different family, but same strategy. Those closed cones will stay that way until the environmental cue. So moving on, the Cupressaceae cypress family, it's another old group of conifers that arose around 200 million years ago. These have a global distribution, 32 genera, around 162 species. And in California, we have 8 of those genera and around 20 species. Hesperocypress are our cypress. Kamea cyperus is like our Port Orford cedar. Calotropsis, Alaskan yellow cedar. Sequoia's redwood, Sequoia giant redwood. Juniperus is juniper. Calocedrus is the incense cedar. And Thuya is like the western red cedar. So these are Cupressaceae are representatives of trees and shrubs. By and large, they are mostly evergreen. They're monoecious, so you have basically both male and female reproductive structures on the same plant. The seed cones take about 2 years to ripen. And as mentioned, for most of these taxa, they'll stay closed until exposed to extreme heat or fire, which tells you that, especially for the California ones, that it suggests a long evolutionary relationship with fire. The leaves themselves, as opposed to the needle-like leaves of pines, they're scale-like and oppressed. So you can kind of see in this Western juniper photo on the right, where they're sort of just flattened, and often just overlapped against one another. A lot of these produce resinous oils, and they tend to have a preference, or they're successful on low nutrient soils. Many have relationships with arbuscular mycorrhizae, soil-borne fungi that basically aid in nutrient and water uptake in exchange for energy via photosynthesis from the plant. First example, It's kind of it's the rock star of California trees, the coast redwood. It's California state tree. And it's, as mentioned, is the tallest tree in the world. The record one stands at 379.1 feet. And it's in a grove, well protected in Humboldt County. As mentioned, it's a paleoendemic that formerly had a far more extensive range. So there have been fossils found in Canada, Mexico, Asia, and Europe. But it's been kind of in its current range, which is just the very southern tip of Oregon, down to around Big Sur for the past 20 million years or so. And, it's thinking about Mediterranean climate. In order to produce the biomass to be a tree, let alone a tree growing almost 400 feet tall, that requires a lot of water. How do you do that in a Mediterranean climate that experiences 6 months, maybe more, of drought? And, when you have, in our growing season like this one, maybe almost 2 months of virtually no rain, what happens? Well, if you look at the range of redwood, it basically correlates directly with the summer fog belt. So during the summer, when interior regions of the state are warmed, cause the gradient, brings in the fog. Anyone from the Bay Area spent much time on the coast is well familiar, for better or worse. But that's where the redwoods get most of their precipitation. They, basically the fog comes in, they're able to take a lot of it up through their leaves, high up in the canopy, and that basically is enough of a buffer to keep them going. So yeah, again, their range is really just tightly linked to where summer fog still occurs. Has really dire implications for climate change. So yeah, but interesting things about it, they have dimorphic leaves, meaning they produce two types of leaves. In the lower canopy, they have these flattened linear leaves kind of in the shady understory. So in the central bottom photo, and there's not much light. If you've been to redwood forest, not much light makes it down into the forest floor. That's why, again, like in a redwood forest, there are not many other trees growing amidst them. It's a very sparse understory, largely due to this lack of light. So it's thought that the flattened leaves really help kind of capture any kind of maybe sun flecks, diffuse light that comes through. But high up in the canopy, say 300 feet up, it's a whole different climate. It's exposed to the very dry summer heat, where you might actually be, it's instead of trying to get as much light as possible, you might be trying to minimize a lot of the light uptake and just to not be stressed. And so they produce these kind of, in the bottom left photo, you see these scale-like, very narrow leaves where they're kind of high up in the canopy. Seed development for these takes 1 year. And to note, it's the only polyploid conifer, it's a hexaploid. So close relative up in the Sierra Nevada, we have the giant sequoia, Sequoia dendron giganteum. It's called sometimes the Sierra redwood as well. Another champion, this is the largest tree in the world, and not by height, but just due to biomass. And so very similar to what I was just talking about, the kind of high canopy leaves of the dimorphic leaves that redwoods produce. Giant sequoias occur in, even though they're high up in the mountains, they're snowpack. It's much warmer. It's a different type of ecosystem. They don't always close up the canopy quite as much as coastal redwoods. You're not getting fog. All of the leaves are of a single type, those very narrow scale-like leaves. And seed development in giant sequoias take about 2 years. So moving on to Hesperocyparis, or cypresses. These are monoecious. They produce both male and female reproductive structures in the same plant. Seed cones take 2 years to ripen, and as mentioned, most taxa they'll stay closed until exposed to some kind of environmental cue, often heat or fire, and their preference or tolerance for low nutrient soils like serpentine and sandstones, They have a high diversity that's often correlated with a type of environmental or geographical isolation. So there's within our native cypress, there's a high level of endemism. That is species that only occur in one specific locality in the world. So some examples of this, we talked about the Monterey cypress a little bit on the far left here. The natural populations are endemic to a current small belt of Monterey County right along coastal bluffs, formerly much more widespread. It's a widely planted one that people are familiar with, but its natural habitat are sea bluffs and marine headlands. Tecate cypress, this is distributed from the Santa Ana Mountains of Southern California and continues down into northern Baja, Mexico. And it grows in these very kind of dry, kind of chaparral margins, or even sometimes just within chaparral on very rocky, nutrient-poor soils. Baker cypress, or Modoc cypress as some call it, is in Northern California in the Siskiyou Range, and a little bit kind of getting over into the Modoc Plateau, where it grows on serpentine and volcanic soils. And that's kind of, it has just two main kind of clusters of populations, and they're all really thriving in these areas where, again, not many trees can tolerate the soils, so they're able to really proliferate. Some other examples, we have Sargent cypress on the left here. This photo is from the Cedars in Sonoma County, a pretty amazing area of kind of ultramafic, just a very large serpentinite exposure in kind of mountainous area of northern Sonoma County. This habitat can barely support even herbaceous plants, but if you look at the photo, these are tall mountains, and they form these kind of Sargent cypress forests in a way, and it's amazing how they're able to even do that. So their kind of tolerance for serpentine is kind of amazing. In the middle here, we have the Paiute cypress, which is endemic to around the southern Sierra Nevada and the Paiute Range around Kern County. And this grows, this was taken, there was a fire 1-2 years ago. They grown again, very fire-prone chaparral, and people worried that one of the major core populations was going to get taken out by the fire. A couple of years later, you come back and recruits are just blanketing the slopes. So another one that has a close linked relationship with fire. McNabb cypress on the right. These are often found in volcanic soils, occasionally serpentine, usually in kind of the north coast heading up towards the Klamath. This was in the burn scar of the Glass Fire of 2020 in the Miacamas Mountains of Napa County. So you can see just about everything else, kind of burned. This is a new regrowth. Well, I guess this is partially burned, partial regrowth, but again, they really kind of gravitate towards these fire-prone environments. Different setup slightly, or different habitats. These are our kind of coastal sandstone endemics. The Gowan cypress is a Monterey County endemic, Hesperocypress gaviniana, which grows on slightly inland Pleistocene marine terrace and acidic sandstone. So it's a little bit away from the direct coast, but it's on these marine terraces that have these very acidic kind of sandstone soils, where it really kind of is the dominant tree with occasional Monterey pine. Mendocino cypress in the middle. If anyone's been to the pygmy forests of Mendocino County, ecological staircase is another name for that area. These thrive on also these kind of Pleistocene inland marine deposits. They're these marine shelves that have been uplifted over time. And the soil condition is this very harsh acidic sandstone. So plants that, this one interestingly is sometimes found off of the sandstone, where you'll see plants that grow, 80, just kind of towering, kind of classic, what you think of as seeing planted Monterey cypress. But in these pygmy forest environments with the sandstone, they'll be sometimes 3 feet tall, maybe if you're lucky, 7 feet tall. And these are old plants, they're not young. That's just what they're coping with that's what they're able to take up with the nutrient constraints of their environment. And the Santa Cruz cypress, a little more locally on the right, it grows in nutrient-poor Miocene sandstone associated with Butana Ridge and also Bonnie Dune in particular, where a lot of these are concentrated in Santa Cruz County. And the next major group, talk about the pines, the pine family, Pinaceae. So these arose around 155 to 200 million years ago. There are 12 genera total, and 5 of which occur in California. We have Pinus, pines, Pseudotsuga, which are Douglas fir, Tsuga, which is hemlock, Abies, fir, and Picea, spruce. So there are 225 species of pine globally, 64 in North America, and we have 32 in California. So half of the pine species in North America. It's considerable. In general, their distribution is kind of constrained to the temperate northern hemisphere. So these are the largest conifer family in the world. They're predominantly trees, rarely shrubs, monoecious. They produce pollen cones as well as seed cones, often with lots of resins. They have notable relationships with mycorrhizal fungi. In particular, you'll often see in fall and winter, lots of Amanita muscaria growing around pine forests. Evergreen leaves, they are deciduous in larynx and pseudolarynx, which we don't have in California, but they all produce these needle-like leaves that are enclosed in fascicles. Dispersal, you can see in the top there. The pollen, anyone with allergies is well familiar. It's dispersed via wind. And so, I won't get into the subgenera, but there are different, basically, pines can be separated in different groups, and sometimes it doesn't always taxonomically hold, but as mentioned, the needles are enclosed in structures called fascicles, which just basically kind of contain the bundle of needles. And so sometimes people refer to the 5-needle pines as the white pines, 3-needle pines as yellow pines, and again, doesn't always hold up. In certain parts of North America, there are ecological kind of associations with those. So just different ways of sorting that out. Seed dispersal for pines is primarily by wind, or is kind of, I guess you could say, environmental sort of passive dispersal. But in some cases, you have active zoochory animal dispersal, such as the Clark's, let's put Clark's nutcracker, Clark's nuthatch, and the limber pine, which you can see in the Cascades and part of the Sierra Nevada. Leaves we talked about, they produce needles, needle-like leaves, generally 1 to 8 needles that are wrapped in the base by a thin membrane called the fascicle. And these are arranged in a spiral shape around the shoot. Some examples of cones here. As mentioned, the coulter pine, which is native to California. It's the heavy cone of any pine in the world. If you're out in any of these kind of coulter pine areas, you do not want to be there on a windy day. These are heavy and they can do some major damage if one comes off and lands on you. These tend to occur in foothills, chaparral, and oak woodland. Also generally very nutrient poor, kind of shallow soil, hot environments. Sugar pine on the right has the largest, largest cone of any pine in the world, basically by weight and size. And it has a more montane distribution in California, Nevada, and Oregon. We get some basically up in Napa County, kind of closer to the coast, but by and large, they're more montane. Notable species to kind of cover here is the ancient bristlecone pine. If you ever have the chance to go visit any of these areas where they occur, I highly recommend it. These are the oldest non-clonal trees on Earth. The oldest known individual on Earth, often called the Methuselah tree, it's estimated to be about 5,069 years old, and it occurs in the White Mountains of California, a little southeast of Bishop, eastern Sierra Nevada, grading into Great Basin. And it occurs from around 9,800 to 11,000 feet in the dolomite soils of the White Mountains. And, you look at the photos and you think, yeah, like these trees look dead. What's wrong with them? And it's, nope, these are very phenomenally old plants that, these aren't young, despite the fact that they're probably barely taller than a human standing next to it. But they grow in these extremely stressful environments, very high elevation, low oxygen. It's, just to the west of them is Mount Whitney, the tallest mountain in North America, creating a very pronounced rain shadow, which, so not much precipitation makes it beyond that. What little does barely makes it up there as kind of a light dusting snowfall, which is what they were essentially relying on for their moisture needs in the summer, with maybe occasional monsoon storms coming in. So it's a very extremely stressful environment. That high up, you also get high winds, extremely low temperatures. So they're very much extremophiles and have these kind of amazing bonsai contorted shapes where they occur. The next major group of trees that I want to talk about, mostly the oaks, but as a group, it's the Fagaceae, which is the beech family. So the three genera that we have are Quercus, Notholithocarpus, and Chrysolepis. We have little over 20 species in California, several different subspecies and varieties. Many of these are arborescent or tree-like, such as our coast live oak, valley oak, blue oak, California black oak, tan oaks. Many are shrubs. Many, especially in Southern California, a lot are evergreen shrub oaks. And there's lots of hybridization that occurs. So oaks in general, they're the top dominant tree genus in North America as far as number of species as well as biomass. They dominate many woodland environments across North America. Mexico is the global center of oak diversity. As far as evolution, there's been a number of different theories posited, but it's now thought that they radiated from the boreal zone up north, beginning around 45 million years ago, came down through eastern North America into Mexico and Central America, basically moving along moisture gradients. And they kind of speciated and radiated between these kind of deciduous and evergreen leaf habits. So there's kind of this simultaneous, it's called like parallel sympatric speciation among the white oak and red oak groups, just according to different localized conditions. And so the major habitat in California in which they occur, we talked about in the beginning, are oak woodlands or sometimes oak savannas. And, their oaks are really important ecologically and as far as, species and land cover group in California, yet oak woodlands encompass 8 to 9% of California land area. We talked about the different types of oak woodlands a little bit. This map on the right kind of shows how some of those are distributed. Blue oaks are really in the hot interior. Coast live oak woodland, really kind of in the coastal mountains. Valley oaks, it's, you get little bits of overlap here and there, but generally these valley bottoms associated with kind of mountainous habitat. Oregon oak up in the northern kind of more mesic areas. Engelmann oak, a small interesting area around the Santa Rosa Plateau in Southern California. So the interesting thing about California's oaks, anyone who spent time on the East Coast knows that yes, there are quite a few species. The majority of them are deciduous. They're broadleaf, and they drop their leaves, in early fall, responsible for a lot of the fall color foliage that you get out there. In California, our oaks are predominantly evergreen, and they're called sclerophyllous, which is basically a type of foliage that's very thick and leathery. And it's one that's evolved. It's an adaptation for xeric conditions. Xeric meaning dry, kind of drought prone, hot conditions that are very stressful for plants, stressful for thinking about water loss when water is limited in an environment. So most of our oaks are evergreen, with the exception of California black oak, valley oak, blue oak, and Oregon oak. But these sclerophyllous leaves, they have these what are called deep stomatal pits. So on the underside of the leaves, gas exchange for leaves is conducted through stomata on the underside of the leaves. But what also happens with gas exchange, respiration, transpiration, that's where water is lost. So one way to cope with that during the hot, dry, kind of drought-prone summers, they have these kind of stomatal crypts or pits, which is just kind of a buffer. Sometimes there's hairs or other layers, just kind of give a buffer so that water isn't as readily lost as quickly when being just exposed to full sun and high heat. Pubescence, hairs are another adaptation often associated with dealing with challenges of water loss, but also photosynthetic efficiency. There are advantages. If you have these trade-offs that minimize water loss, hey, you can photosynthesize year-round. Other plants that, that are deciduous, they lose their leaves during inoptimal times, they're not able to photosynthesize. Oaks can. They deal with drought through this amazing kind of water potential. Most of them produce these very deep tap roots. If anyone's, deal with planting oaks or doing any restoration work with oak woodlands, a lot of people suggest instead of planting seedlings, saplings, or mature plants, it's really ideal to start with the acorn because growth starts right away by basically just developing this really strong and really foundational taproot. And that's basically how the plant, as it grows slowly at first, is able to deal with water stress throughout much of the year. In late summer, there's going to be no water availability towards the surface. So if you have shallow roots, how are you going to be able to continue photosynthesizing? How are you going to survive? And this is one way that oaks have been able to do that. So they're able to get water during, like the blue oaks, 107 degrees, peak summer, no water in months, but they're still able to harness water deep under the soil through this. So just to kind of bring it a little more, back home for everyone here, I just wanted to go over, there's so many, we have so many trees in California, so many species, 150 some odd. It would be impossible, exhausting, and probably kind of boring to just kind of go through and talk about individual species, which is why I wanted to cover these major groups and some of their patterns. But just close to home, since I assume most of you are involved one way or another with San Pedro Valley Park, just want to highlight a few plants from the park that feel kind of ecologically significant for California that you can experience right here. One of these is the madrone, Arbutus menziesii. This is in the Ericaceae, which is the heath and blueberry family. It's very closely related to Arctostaphylos manzanitas, very widespread dominant group of plants in California. And these produce broad and evergreen leaves. They're most often known for their smooth orange-red kind of peeling bark, very kind of unique appearance on the landscape. And they have these fleshy fruit that you can see on the right that are dispersed by birds in the fall. Interestingly, the closely related manzanitas, which occur in chaparral, it's a whole different conditions. Madrones tend to occur in mixed conifer and oak woodland, a little more shady and mesic, maybe a little more water. Whole different types of dispersal, seed dispersal. Chaparral plants tend to have kind of these hardened fruit that are rodent dispersed and cached underground, and those are often dormant fruit. Madrone, just due to this slight habitat shift over, has a whole different suite of dispersal vectors, which are predominantly birds. So they produce these soft succulent fruits that are not dormant and that are able to get taken far away via birds as a really effective dispersal mechanism. These occur up through British Columbia, down through much of California. And like many plants, they have a long evolutionary relationship with fire. On the left here, we see this was in the burn that came through Bonnie Doon in Santa Cruz County a couple years back, and the whole canopy, basically all standing plants in this area were taken out. But this is within several months of the fire, and you already see new growth emerging from the basal burl. The burl is something within the whole Arbutoides, the lineage that encompasses Madrona and Manzanitas. They all basically evolved with this, which is basically just a meristematic area at the base of the stem, selected for fire. Fire comes through, kills the standing vegetation, but it gives a cue that prompts immediate new growth from the base. Really, really interesting. And a lot of California woody plants have this same mechanism. Another plant that you can see is creek dogwood, Cornus sericea, variety sericea. It's in the Cornaceae, and it's a deciduous tree. Very different story here. It grows in riparian mesic forest, often in deep shade, so along creeks or very kind of moist forest understory. They're deciduous, losing their leaves in late fall typically. And they flower in mid-spring, kind of forming these very tight clustered inflorescences that will begin blooming soon after the new leaves emerge. Classic, kind of iconic California tree is the California buckeye, Aesculus californica. It's in the Sapindaceae, also with the maples. And this is an interesting one because, contrary to the dogwood, which is winter deciduous, this one is summer deciduous. And that maybe is reflective of the fact that it tends to occur, it's variable. It occurs in woodlands, sometimes riparian habitat, but you also can find it in chaparral openings in dry environments. So while we typically, I'd say in North America, think of deciduous plants being a reflection of losing their leaves during the winter, this is one that basically evolved to lose their leaves during the summer. And that's how it deals with the summer drought stress. So yeah, it'll lose its leaves and they'll start to come back basically in late winter, early spring, and produce their flowers soon afterwards, these beautiful kind of clusters that you can see there on the right. And then they produce these very distinctive large pear-shaped fruit, such as in the left photo, which are contained in this kind of leathery capsule, and it just produces one or two very massive seeds that will almost immediately put down a root once they hit the ground. An interesting one that, it's not necessarily the most charismatic, but I think it's kind of a fascinating one. It's Euonymus occidentalis, Variety occidentalis. It's the western burning bush. It's in the Celastraceae, a family generally, it's more dominant in the tropics. California has 3 representatives. So this is a plant that it's not rare, but it's not common. So it's widespread across the state, but occurs in very patchy distributions. If you encounter one, you're not going to see a whole woodland or a slope covered in them. You might see one or a few plants. And San Pedro Valley is one of the areas where you can actually really easily see these, which is pretty cool. They're deciduous, lose their leaves in the winter. They occur in shaded kind of coastal coniferous forest. The leaves turn kind of a crimson red before senescing in the fall, which is how it gets its common name of burning bush. And that's kind of all I have. So yeah, open if anyone has any questions. Hopefully that didn't drag on too long.
Morgan, that was absolutely phenomenal. So in depth. Just wow, you really worked on this one. No doubts about that. So let's go quickly to the Q&A. It says, hi, Morgan, where did you grow up around here? Well, you didn't.
Grew up in San Francisco, various parts, but spent most of my life living back here, kind of in the Richmond and Sunset District's part of town. Yeah.
And I noticed that places that have a lot of trees have little towns called Sugarloaf. Is this because there are a lot of sugar pines in the area?
I don't know. I would I would like to say yes. I mean, that would be a, nice association, but I'm not sure.
Okay, and then we have a California buckeye in our visitor center's native plant garden. Can you tell us about its distribution and habitat? Well, I think you've covered that, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious about why you said Monterey cypress are not preferred. You may have said, but I missed it. Please explain. Are
Yeah,
not
to clarify, I didn't mean that they are not preferred as a species. What I meant is that um, they have evolutionary evolved to have a tolerance for very stressful conditions, nutrient poor soils, these very challenging environments for plants. But just what I was saying is that even though they are able to thrive in those environments, it doesn't mean that they're preferred. That is, that if they are able to successfully establish on another type of soil that has maybe more higher nutrient content, less wind, less salt spray, they'll do just fine. But it's basically an evolutionary trade-off that they have they're selected for that environment, which is how they're able to escape competition from other plants.
something about status and health of madrone in San Pedro Valley Park?
Oh,
There,
I'm not sure if that's in reference to Phytophthora.
I'm not sure that's all there is. So we'll move. Yeah, it's not too clear. Do invasive species like eucalyptus and pride of Madeira threaten native species?
I mean, it's kind of a loaded question in that, sure. I mean, where they're established, it's displacing environment for native species. I would argue that there are far more invasive species that are more of concern to native ones. Eucalyptus stands, sure, they can be extensive, but they're by and large where they occur are where they were initially planted. There are exceptions, sure, they can
spread.
I mean, they can spread, but in general, you don't see eucalyptus really kind of running rampant and kind of taking off in the way that, say, like French broom, brooms or other stuff like, it's where those are kind of, I feel like eucalyptus in general, they retain in areas where they were intentionally planted. Same thing with Pride of Madeira. There are exceptions, but they're not aggressive competitors, and they don't as readily get established in natural environments, which is where it can really be an issue.
From Amarok, we have an extremely knowledgeable and clearly you have a love and passion for your subject comment. In your work as a botanist, what do you do on a daily basis?
It depends on the project. A lot of times for rare plant, well, let's see. A lot of rare plant censusing is, you're basically surveying an area. You're basically putting together a plant list for an environment. If you find anything rare, you want to flag it. You want to take any kind of coordinates. If it's not known from that area, you take information to submit to CNDDB or some other organization to basically know that it's there and to allow protection for that. There's not just one avenue. There's also there's some experimental stuff. We did a lot of last year. I did experimental hand pollination with the rare Durca occidentalis, Western leatherwood on the peninsula. Lots of experimental kind of seed amplification, seeding experiments with a lot of thistles and different things like that. It kind of depends.
It certainly varies.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Morgan, do you know what type of oaks we have in the park?
I'm pretty sure it's
Coast Live.
It's mostly Coast Live, and then I believe, got it? No, I think it is all Coast Live oak. There is Chrysolepis, which is same family, but yeah, not a true oak.
It says we seem, Joanne is asking about or commenting about the fact that we have a lot less fog than when I was growing up in this area. And how will that affect the redwoods along our coast?
It's a major concern. You know, a lot of climate models show basically a major decrease in summer fog, which from our understanding of the biology of redwoods could considerably threaten them. And probably, you know, it's, if we think of things moving kind of south and north as far as kind of a decrease in summer fog or heating and otherwise, it's thought that maybe their range will continue to kind of compress. You know, we'll probably, I won't say probably, but you know, we may lose the southernmost ones, the Big Sur, as you know, as we lose the fog down that way. But it remains to be seen. It's
Yeah, the trees are going to be more and more stressed as there's less and less rain and less fog.
It's, I mean, rain is always an issue, but redwoods have been here a long time, and fog is there. It's their kind of silver bullet for coping with these kind of drought years. So it's a big deal.
I know that you pop down to San Pedro Valley Park every so often. Have you seen any sign of sudden oak death? Rainbow is asking about that.
I mean, I'm not, let's see, I'm not necessarily the best, like, there are others who are more attuned to what kind of symptoms to look for as far as, you know, kind of signs of sudden oak death. There's, I mean, I feel confident that there are plants that are hosting it. You know, like multiple plants are hosts, whether passive or otherwise. California Bay, Madrone, Manzanitas. I'm a little worried about the brittle leaf Manzanita, Arctavos crustacea. A lot of those further down the peninsula, you get Jasper Ridge, and some of the ones that we have on SFPC land are starting to show signs of stress and maybe dieback. Like, it's thought to be maybe a combination of Phytophthora and drought. So hopefully we're not seeing the same thing in San Pedro Valley, but some of the Montara Mountain Manzanita, which you get at San Pedro Valley, some of the other populations are starting to show signs of stress and likely Phytophthora. So it's,
I haven't seen the oaks I haven't seen the sudden oak in the park.
Tan oak is, which is a Notholithocarpus densiflorus, is the one that really has kind of taken the big hit around the Bay Area for sudden oak death, which don't have at San Pedro Valley. But there's some really kind of devastating areas of dieback that you can see around Mount Tam and parts of the peninsula where it's been hit really hard. That, like, coast live oak may suffer localized dieback. I don't know. Yeah.
I'm not a specialist either, so in that regard by any means. So, and Morgan, do you have a favorite tree?
It might be the Sierra juniper for California.
Really? Yeah.
I don't know. It's the first time driving through the High Sierra. You know, I remember just driving, you're going through just that like kind of surreal granitic boulder-strewn landscape, and you're just seeing these bonsai, just bizarre contorted trees with really scraggly bark, but still, you know, and they're fine. They're doing great. You know, it's just kind of a surreal landscape. I don't know. I'm a sucker for extremophiles and, you know, these kind of, especially woody plants that have just evolved really kind of surreal, inventive ways of coping with new stresses imposed on their environments.
One of the attendees is asking about the photo on your title page. There must be a tree there.
Yeah, I can get back there. Let's see. Oh, sorry, going to be scrolling through a lot of this. Okay, almost there. Okay.
So
what was the question?
the trees.
So this was taken from Scott Mountain in the Klamath and Trinity in Northern California. And I couldn't tell you species, but it's the ones in the forefront are some kind of fir, ABs, could be Shasta red fir. Again, we're at this area is close to the Miracle Mile I discussed.
Oh, yeah.
Conifers are amazingly diverse out here. So judging just based on the silhouette, I wouldn't I wouldn't feel confident going to species, because there's, there can be multiple, 3-4 different species within the same genus in this area. It's a fantastically rich area of conifer diversity. So
well, everyone is remarking on the depth and the knowledge that you have so kindly shared with us. It's truly, truly remarkable.
Being interested.
Let's see. Closed cones, but seedlings start. So the Monterey pines, they have closed cones, but the seedlings start without fire.
They
So
can. Yeah.
They can.
Yeah.
It's the Monterey pines seem to spread like wildfire.
I mean, they're an interesting case because, like the Monterey cypress, but maybe 100-fold, those Monterey pines, their native habitat is it's essentially adjacent to Monterey cypress, just a little bit inland and on those kind of nutrient poor marine sandstones, very acidic areas. So there's a really interesting paper that was done about 20 years ago that basically just showed kind of they've been around a long time and formerly had them. I'm kind of skirting around the question, but I'm answering it eventually. They've had a much larger natural distribution, but have kind of moved, kind of retreated and then expanded based on different climate patterns, inter-ice age kind of periods, followed by, they really boom following increasing kind of drying and fire, episodes of like greater fire regimes, and really kind of emphasizing their positive relationship, or I should say tolerant relationship with fire. And they've kind of retreated naturally to this area in Monterey, but they are readily cultivated and planted. So I don't know if this actually holds up, but I've been told that Monterey pine is maybe the most invasive tree in the world. It's planted, because like Monterey cypress too, it evolved to tolerate these very stressful conditions, but if it can establish in another habitat away from the competitive constraints that are in its natural area, it'll thrive. It'll grow quickly, it'll grow fast, tall, quick, and
but it doesn't sprout from the trunk. It just literally has seedlings that just shoot up everywhere.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
there's probably in areas that, considering the fire, like again, thinking about areas where they've been or where they've been established, there's a seed bank there.
Yes.
There's cones too, so there's a
Yes.
there's a ready seed source.
I think that, with all due respect, Morgan, you've given us so much that that we need to give you a break, and just everyone who has attended and has written in has just been thrilled by such a erudite lecture on your part, and a very thorough lecture, and given us a really good idea about the trees, in a much more fundamental way than we had ever thought, we'd ever hear. So thank you so much. And I think we will leave. I think you've answered most of the questions, and I just wish to thank you I had no idea I had landed you with such a huge, formidable job when I thought about native trees of California, and so glad you tackled it so well.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for attending, everyone.
So good night and thank you, everyone. And we're going to end this webinar tonight. And yes, for those of you who may have missed the beginning or not have caught everything, this lecture has been recorded and will be on our website, the Friends of San Pedro Valley Park.org, in a week or two. So you can definitely catch all of it there. So thank you and good night to all.
Night.
Thank you, Morgan. Good night.